Hi there and welcome to ET Now. I'm Ashwin Mohan and you're watching Amicus Curiae, where we get you the sharpest views from the world of corporate law, tax, regulatory affairs and mergers and acquisitions. Now, as we approach the end of 2018, corporate governance controversies at India Inc. have assumed center stage yet again. Previously, we had seen these controversies breaking out at the House of Tatas and Infosys, and over the course of the last few weeks, Yes Bank, IL&FS and Sun Pharma have come under the scanner of the investor community. So on Amicus Curiae this week, we are getting you three big and exclusive voices. M. Damodaran, former chairperson at SEBI, Anand Mahindra, the chairman of the Mahindra Group, and Uday Kotak, the executive vice chairman and MD at Kotak Mahindra Bank. All these three gentlemen were together at the Corporate Governance Summit, the 2018 edition of the Corporate Governance Summit organized by Excellence Enablers Private Limited. So for the next half an hour, sit back and let the thoughts and views of these three biggies sink in.
The peg on which we want to hang this entire conversation is what I have stated. Are there too many regulations? Are we getting too prescriptive? Are we telling everybody every morning, do this, do that, do the other, don't do this, don't do that? And in some sense, not allowing people to figure out what is right and wrong and to go on those process. Is life getting increasingly prescriptive in the corporate space?
I was a little concerned when you described us as people for whom there was very little disconnect between thought and word. And I was trying to imagine that could also describe the current president of the United States. So I'm not sure this is a compliment at all. But I usually try to make sure there's a relatively good disconnect, at least in time, between thought and word, so that I have time to think about it. And I'm giving myself that time, obviously, to answer your question. But this is it's a very interesting question to ask as to whether things are getting too prescriptive. You know, there used to be that old saying during the license Raj that for every action, there's an equal and opposite government program, sort of a new Newtonian law, if you will. And sometimes you wake up and get that sense that are people forgetting that what you're trying to regulate is business? And one of the most articulate practitioners of business, a man called George Dorio, who virtually invented American venture capitalism, he used to say that, look, your job is not to eliminate risk. It's to eliminate unwarranted risk. And your job as a manager, in fact, is to assume risk, and the more risk you take, the more reward you get. So risk is a very, very integral element of the entire capitalist system. Sometimes I wake up and it's not the prescriptiveness, it's the sheer proliferation of regulations that almost seem to be designed to eliminate risk. And so I would only start this conversation by saying that the fine line we have to walk is to ensure that with everything we are doing, and I don't mind it being prescriptive, regulations are meant to be prescriptive, just a question of the plethora of regulations and how do we decide when we are getting to the point where we are creating bureaucrats and process followers and eliminating risk and therefore eliminating the very vital ingredient of what constitutes business enterprise. Forget India, I think we saw a drama play out recently in the US with Elon Musk. And it was prescriptive, it was something that reined him in. I think most people would agree that he needed to be reined in. I mean, smoking pot on a radio show and sort of talking policy after that does sound excessive. But Musk represents that vibrancy of capitalism, the vibrancy of vision, of taking risk. His entire persona is based on taking risk. So I think what I'd love to understand and have as a conversation with everybody here, how do you measure when the risk has been eliminated and therefore capitalism in a sense has been quelled as opposed to simply being regulated and curbed? That to me, I don't think we have an answer to yet.
Uday, you've been in the forefront of the effort to improve regulations, fill in regulatory gaps, address regulatory overlaps. Did you have a sense of discomfort being a corporate leader, being a very successful person in the commercial space? A sense of discomfort that this entire committee system, comprising a lot of people from different interest groups, was trying to create a kind of a narrow path in which you cannot tell people that take decisions, that take risks, as Anand said, from those that were following procedure, seeking safety in doing what several people have done before, not venturing to go where no man has gone before, because that is, I think, what leads to progress. Did you get a sense of discomfort when you led the committee?
I wanted to first start by something which I was told as a child by my grandfather. And he said that in life there are two kinds of rules. God-made rules and man-made rules. Never break the God-made rules. Be ready to question man-made rules. And this is the philosophy which I think is at the heart of the issue between form and substance. And what we are dealing with is a society which, with an intent to control or manage substance, has moved significantly in the direction of rules versus principles. And I think the reason for that is actually in the financial sector in particular. It goes back to the global financial crisis which happened in 2007-8. And if you look at the whole area of evolution of regulation and supervision pre-2008, it was on principles. And what we saw happen in the financial markets is a race to the bottom. And inevitably, a Bank A versus Bank B. Bank A, which followed principles, Bank B, which said, let me push the envelope on principles. Bank A lost out, and you saw a inevitable race to the bottom, leading to the global financial crisis. So there has been a shift in the whole journey on regulation, more towards rule-based philosophy versus just the principle-based philosophy. And this is a fundamental shift we are seeing in the last decade or so in particular. If you go back to the UK, you had a FSA which was separated from the Bank of England, and the whole narrative pre-2008 was very different from what we are seeing today. And that brings us to the heart of the issue on letter versus spirit. What we are finding today in the world of regulation is that when one takes a view that let's follow the spirit and the letter is not clear, therefore you go with the spirit, you inevitably get a pushback. Hey, don't give me the spirit business. This is the rule. Have you followed it or not? And you get a slap back. Therefore, if you take a view based on spirit, you run into problem. Therefore, even if spirit is a question mark on a particular rule, you then say, listen, I have no ability to question spirit. Let me at least follow the rule. So we are living in this world which is going through this transition in a way from principles to rules, and there may be a spirit behind the letter, but people forget the spirit and the letter remains, and we have to deal with this. Having said that, I think in the world of corporate governance, the challenge which we face is measurement of the rules. And I will use a tennis analogy here. And I'll speak about it in the context of my own career. In the early days of my career, I was very comfortable hitting the ball on the line. Okay, which means it's still inside and valid, but hit the ball on the line and be open to hitting it on the line. I've now come to a view, make sure that you hit the ball inside the line. Because if it hits the line, then you have an umpire who decides whether it's outside or inside. And God forbid, if the umpire says it's outside, you are in deep trouble. Therefore, a fundamental philosophic change which I have moved towards is make sure that come what may, work towards following the rules, but hit the ball clearly inside the line and don't take the risk of even trying to hit on the line.
Can I ask him a
Yeah.
question? Uday, you put a brilliant metaphor there, and it's related to what I was saying. Do you think that by hitting inside the line, you have, in a sense, taken less risk than you would have, and maybe foregone certain opportunities to grow?
I wanted to supplement that, saying the increasing margin of safety as you get away from the line and more inside, is that leading to suboptimal results?
The risks of the umpires saying you hit outside the line are much greater, including the reputational risks, than hitting inside the line. Therefore, when you're looking at risk, Anand, there is that reputational risk. And in a 24/7 media, you're first hung in the court of media well before you go out into the real world.
In the regulated environment of business, it's much worse because it's not just the one point that you lose. I think there is reputation risk attached, there's all manner of things attached. Are you sensing that post 2008, and clearly that's a landmark, not just for the financial sector, but for the global economy. Post 2008, our regulators worldwide, in order to prove that they belong, that they're relevant, that what they do is legitimate, are pushing the envelope.
You're asking a regulated entity or an unregulated entity?
Both.
Okay, I think the regulators are also grappling with this, because for every good story, there are half a dozen stories which are a problem. And I can sort of relate to the current financial sector situation in India. And you sit back and ask the question, where does the system draw the line? And again, I'm more in the context of the financial sector. If you look at 6 layers of checks, including in the financial sector, the first layer, of course, is the management. The second layer is the board. The third layer is shareholders, particularly the institutional shareholders. Fourth layer is the auditors. Fifth layer for leveraged financial institutions is the rating agencies. And the sixth layer is the regulator and the supervisor. Now we are seeing a number of situations where in the world of markets where there are minority shareholders who have very little say otherwise, or even debt holders, these 6 layers of checks and balances need to be working. And we are finding situations where you question whether some or all of these layers are not doing their fiduciary job. And how do you work towards a situation where finally the blame comes on policymakers when all the 5 or 6 layers fail? So how do you deal with that and the reaction of the public where money is at risk? And it is a backlash, and then there's a societal backlash. There is very social media has changed the parameters of B2B to B2C in the whole communication, and B2C with relatively limited understanding of the reality. You can see things getting out of control, and regulators therefore have had to meet this challenge of being responsible disproportionately as well.
So Damodaran, the reason I wanted you in the conversation rather than sitting out there is because you could come in very, very strongly on issues like this. You've been a regulator.
Yes.
I wanted to flip the question and ask you, because you've seen in the past, as Uday said, the failure of many of these layers, whether it was the rating agencies in 2008, recently also rating agencies in the case of IL&FS. So, having been a regulator, what is your answer to your question? Do you think that they're overreaching right now?
I think let me step back a bit and address 2 other issues before I get to what you are raising. One is, how are regulators appointed? You find someone that is available who seems to be doing nothing much that somebody else cannot do, and therefore put him or her as a regulator. The regulator is not accountable directly to Parliament. You're accountable through a ministry which takes the flak if regulation goes wrong. Occasionally you appear before a parliamentary committee, and if you're sufficiently articulate, you can put across the worst of cases and keep looking at the clock and seeing that it's lunchtime. And there are friendly parliamentarians in the committees who have to take their diabetes shots in time before lunch, and therefore the meeting comes to an end. And I've tried this successfully whenever difficult questions. When I'm making a confessional
now you
statement.
see why I asked him the question.
It is safe to make it 11 years after stepping out of SEBI. But to your question, why are regulators being increasingly prescriptive? Regulators always play black pieces. You don't have in the real world the policeman who runs ahead of the thief. You wait for something to go wrong and then respond. Unfortunately, instead of looking at the laws, the rules, the regulations available to you, your first instinct is to write a new regulation, thinking that no existing regulation addresses what is on hand. So you have a whole body of regulations, some of which is really in some sense restating what exists. And the example that I'm fond of giving is that whenever a murder takes place, nobody says amend the IPC. You go after the guy, collect evidence and try and hang him if possible. But when Satyam happened, even corporate India said we need to amend the laws. Satyam didn't need any amendment of the laws. The existing laws were good enough to deal with Satyam. My worry as somebody who spent 3 years in regulation and a little over 68 years outside of regulation is that regulators firstly should not have a disconnect with the regulated universe. I think anyone who has been regulated is a better candidate, other things being the same, for being a regulator, because you know where the shoe pinches. You know what is practicable, what is pragmatic, what needs to be done. You don't need a sledgehammer to go after a fly, because people notice sledgehammers and say, this guy is very active. He's got the sledgehammer in his hand. You're only going after a fly, you don't need the sledgehammer. Regulators, I think, need to step back, look at regulatory impact assessment, which is critical. We all talk about it. Before you write a new regulation, look at what the impact is. Do you need this regulation? All regulation comes at a cost. It is the beneficiary of your regulation who picks up the tab at the end of the day. So you got to see the cost benefit analysis for that person before you write a fresh regulation. I think the real problem is a philosophical problem, and I want to come back to both of you on this. I'll start with you, Anand. All of this is premised on distrust of business. You believe that if there were no regulations, no regulators, no laws governing this, the businessman will do something wrong in order to enrich himself unjustly. So that is the starting point, unfortunately, of all of this. So you set up the 6 layers that Uday spoke about in order to do this. Will we ever get to a situation where, to use a phrase from diplomacy, get to a situation of trust but verify instead of distrust and crucify? We are now in distrust and crucify. When will we move to trust but verify?
No, you're absolutely right. You put your finger on a problem that, to my mind, is not simply a corporate problem, but I think is a problem of mindset for Indian society. I grew up at a time, I'm sure we are of the same vintage, when there was this enormous mistrust of business, not simply by regulators or government, but by society in general. The names of the 3 largest industrial houses was synonymous with a kind of abuse. If you wanted to abuse somebody, you called him the name of one of those 3 industrialists. Or to call somebody a bania was in fact an insult in the old days. And then, of course, if you wanted people here wanted in the old days to get their daughter married to somebody from the IAS or IFS, never a businessman. Post the IT boom, that refreshingly seemed to change, and we started getting iconic heroes from business. And then, of course, liberalization came along, things improved. During the dot-com boom, suddenly everybody wanted their daughter to get married to somebody, or their son to get married to a woman who was creating a new unicorn. Unfortunately, not just in India, but even around the world, in the last few years, there have been spectacular business failures. and due to ethical reasons which have, I think, set the clock back. So I don't have an answer to this. How do you change society? I think we need to be more vocal, Uday. I think as business we need to put out there and showcase success stories where people have done business the right way. Recently, I think Uday's market cap overtook Maruti's, and I remember tweeting that, Uday, I'm very proud of you because you achieved it the right way. And I did that for that reason, because I don't think there are enough stories which are role models. We need to put out more of that, because really it's not about changing government perception. It's about societal perception, where in India we've slipped back. I think businessmen have come down a few notches. We need to work back on that, and then it's going to take time. There's no quick fix for this. But I do believe that there is this problem. If we can coming to a more granular level, my belief is that there has to be what somebody called a constructive sense of dissatisfaction between the executive and the board of independent shareholders. A constructive sense of dissatisfaction is not a constructive sense of distrust. I think constructive dissatisfaction as opposed to distrust is what at least we should try and engineer at the board level. The societal change will take a longer time.
In fact, I think I agree with Anand. I believe the society has gone the other way. It has become even more intrusive than the past. I was recently wanting to have a confidential discussion with a friend. So I asked him, why don't you come over to office? He said, I won't come over to your office because from your lobby upwards, there will be cameras. Okay. Now, why do we have that? It's back to the whole business about intrusion, privacy. We need to record everything. Something funny will happen. So we have created a mindset which has become significantly less trustful of the societal aspect. Same thing, how many of us feel comfortable talking freely on a mobile phone, and most of the time we switch over to WhatsApp? Why is that? There is something which is fundamentally changed in society. The informal contract of how we communicate, how we deal with each other has undergone a very significant structural change, and maybe digital age is responsible, number of other factors are responsible, maybe a liberal civil society is giving to the broader needs of the economy of the country, where a little bit of intrusion into what we called as a old-fashioned way of doing things is undergoing a fundamental change. And I think this is something which we have to ask ourselves, where do we want to be?
Right, so that was former SEBI chairperson M. Damodaran, the head of the Mahindra Group, Anand Mahindra, and veteran banker Uday Kotak in a freewheeling chat on various aspects and nuances of corporate governance. Hope you enjoyed that discussion. And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Amicus Curiae. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Ashwin Mohan signing off. I'll see you next week.